So we finished talking about the tissues, and we're going to cover a first system. We're going to start covering the first anatomical system today, and it's going to be the skin, or integumentary system. So it's, as I mentioned before, it is the only cutaneous membrane that is found in the human body. Okay, and it consists of several tissues, but skin is kind of funny. It is organ and technically organ system at the same time. You know, we can count it as an organ, but since it consists of pretty much, there are some other organs like blood vessels inside of it, it becomes sort of a fuzzy distinction whether tissue is an organ or tissue is an organ. So skin is the organ or skin is the organ system. From the standpoint of a structure, it is an organ, classical organ. You know, it consists of multiple tissues, but from the standpoint of function, it has a very specific set of functions that is sort of limited to the skin, they're unique to the skin. Like blood distribution is unique to cardiovascular system, skin has functions that not any other system shares with it. Okay? So it's on the outside, it consists of stratified squamous epithelium. You can see it is yellow in this picture. And it also consists of layers of connective tissue under it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to discuss which tissues are a part of the skin. And in the skin, you're going to find also a lot of its derivatives. Not only epidermis, not only the stratified squamous epithelium, not only the connective tissue layers under the epidermis, but also hair, muscles that elevate those hairs, a number of glands that produce sweat, and the oily secretion that lubricates the skin, prevents it from drying. And functionally, skin, you know, if you ask someone what is the skin function, probably say what? What did you say? Without looking at the PowerPoint. Protection, yes. Still, it's protection. It's all kinds of protection if you think about it. Okay, it is pretty much a mechanical barrier that separates the rest of your body from the outside world. And you can appreciate how painful it is when it is gone for the underlying tissues. It prevents those underlying tissues from dehydration. If we talk about burn victims, one of the major concerns for them is to prevent the water loss, which is enormous because their tissues are not protected, and you know, nothing prevents water from evaporating from the tissues. UV light, mechanical damage, of course, bacterial damage, infections. And that's another interesting topic, since I teach microbiology a lot. I cannot restrict myself from mentioning it. Is your skin sterile? No. Do you get sick of all the microbes that are on your skin? Normally, like day to day? No. They're pretty much your buddies. They live on the skin. They don't bother you. Ideally, you don't bother them, although you do when you take a shower, you bother them a lot, actually. But they, in fact, prevent you from getting sick. If you get too clean, the rate of skin infections and respiratory infections will dramatically increase, because those microbes prevent bed bugs. Bed, I mean B-A-D, not bed bugs. Prevent bed bugs from establishing themselves on the surface of your skin. So, skin, a lot of protection, right? It allows us to identify each other, color, features of the skin, freckles, okay? It helps in expressing our emotions, which is important homeostatically. And you always have to think, when we talk about any system, what contribution to homeostasis does this system have? Okay, skin, I mean protection, we got it. Okay, how else does it contribute to survival of the organism? When we can express our emotions, it helps us to communicate with other members of the population, and it helps us to survive in the population. Humans don't live by themselves. Very important part of the skin function is regulation of the body temperature. It is probably, it's not probably, it is the main, you can leave it there, it's fine. Yeah. It is the most important, singularly most important organ that controls how much heat we shed in the environment. First, sensory perception. Not most, but a decent amount of your sensory experiences come from the skin, from the sense of touch. Now, any questions on the function? Understand the functions of the skin. They're pretty straightforward, but still. Now, structurally, skin consists of two layers: epidermis, the superficial layer of the epithelial tissue, and dermis, the deeper layer of connective. And we're going to talk about epidermis first. It is called either thick or thin skin. So thick skin can be found on the parts of the body that are most exposed to environment, obviously, you know, soles, fingers, palms, okay, toes. Thin skin can be found everywhere else. The thick skin has 5 layers, and thin skin has 4. Stratum lucidum is absent in a thin skin. Now, as you remember, in stratified squamous epithelium, the layers, you know, the bottom layer is always alive, correct? And as you go from the bottom, the deepest layer, to the more superficial layers, cells pretty much progressively die, and the outer layer is completely dead. We discussed it like 1, 2 classes ago. Does that make sense? So, and shape-wise, the deeper layer are more cuboidal, cells closer to the cuboidal shape. As you go up, they're practically flat. And I will require you to know all 5 layers of the skin, as we refer to the thick skin, and functions of those layers and what's going on in those layers. And I will tell you exactly, like, now think about this. What I tell you, I can ask you, okay? But I will try my best to be extremely specific. So the lowermost, the deepest layer of the skin is stratum basale. It's pretty much a single layer of almost cuboidal cells. Okay? These cells are mitotically active. Can anyone explain to me what mitotically active means? They divide. Perfect. And those cells are called keratinocytes. And you can see that I specifically mentioned keratinocytes are in fact stem cells. Now, we have discussed stem cells before, and we have mentioned that they can have, just stem cells in general, can have different potency. Some of them can become practically all cells, some of them can become only very specific set. Keratinocytes can become only one cell, skin cell. So we should call them monopotent. Does that make sense? They can become keratinocytes. They only become better. They differentiate, but they don't make any other cells except skin cells. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, I have mentioned before that every epithelial layer is ultimately attached at the very bottom to the basement membrane. It is not shown here very well, but this is where the basement membrane is. Okay? You see that red line that I put highlighted in blue now? Okay? That's basement membrane. Skin is not an exception. Skin, the epidermis, is attached to the basement membrane. Now, along with the live and mitotically active keratinocytes, in a stratum basale, and that's a Latin word for the basal layer. Stratum is layer, basale is basal. Stratum basale also consists of melanocytes, the pigmentation cells, and Merkel cells, which are responsible for the sensations. Make sense to you? And Merkel cells will sense like sort of a light touch. They can sense pain. They can sense chemicals. They jacks of all trades, actually. Okay? So please, for stratum basale, know that keratinocytes are live mitotically active cells, and understand that Merkel cells and melanocytes are in this layer. Okay? When we go up from stratum basale to the next one, next layer, stratum spinosum, cells are still alive. They start to flatten, and these cells in the stratum spinosum, they are not mitotically active anymore. They do not divide. Is that clear? Along with those non-dividing skin cells, non-dividing keratinocytes, you can find Langerhans cells. You can see this cell that is shaped sort of like a starfish. Langerhans cells represent your first line of, I would say, immune surveillance, which makes actually perfect sense. Think about how many infections can penetrate through the skin, can be acquired through the skin. So you really want some kind of an immune outpost in the skin that could detect those infections early. For example, when you get bitten by a mosquito, and mosquito hypothetically carries West Nile virus. West Nile virus particles, well, mosquito takes a blood meal, right, from the capillary in the subcutaneous tissue, but when it penetrates the skin, when it penetrates the dermis, not some, it's in a dermis, but when it penetrates the epidermis, virus particles kind of get out and around, and Langerhans cells will phagocytose those virus particles and will start to build the immunity against that virus. It was shown in multiple studies that first cells to be infected with a mosquito bite are Langerhans cells. Any questions? Live, non-dividing keratinocytes and Langerhans cells. And next, you've got stratum granulosum, this layer. Okay. You can see now, if you would compare the cells in the stratum granulosum to the cells in the stratum spinosum, for instance, what you're going to notice is that cells become even more flattened, more squamous. And if you look really close, you will notice that the nucleus starts to fade away. Cells in the stratum granulosum start to die. They're not yet dead, but they're not totally alive. They produce an enormous amount of the protein called keratin. The process of that overproduction of keratin is called keratinization. When keratin is overproduced, it essentially kills the cell. Okay? organelles start to disintegrate, nucleus starts to disintegrate, DNA starts to disintegrate, right? So it's a beginning of the end for the cells. And then in the thin skin, and I want you to understand completely clear this, in the thin skin, the next step after the stratum granulosum immediately is stratum corneum. You see how thick this layer is? This upper layer, the most superficial one. Stratum corneum consists entirely of the dead cells. They are totally dead. They're filled with keratin, nothing alive about them. Okay? They are absolutely dry, which prevents microbes from growing. They have a little bit of the antibacterial secretions on the surface, which further prevents microbes from growing. So they are the perfect protection. Okay. Now so for the thin skin, let's go over those 4 layers again. The deepest one is stratum. Come on, you can read it. Stratum, the deepest one. Stratum basale. Basale, it's fine. Stratum basale, then spinosum, then granulosum, and then for the thin skin, corneum. Okay? Thin skin has 4 layers. Now, this layer, stratum lucidum, which is not in the picture, okay? This layer helps to protect against UV light. It also consists of entirely dead cells, okay? But cells that are filled not with a keratin yet, but with a protein called ellaidin. Ellaidin has great capacity to absorb UV light, and it helps in anti-UV light protection. Now, stratum lucidum can be found only in the thick skin, meaning palms, soles, toes, fingers. Make sense? So understand the difference. Then just in thick skin you have 5 layers, in thin skin you have 4. Everybody's okay with that? Any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Only keratin enhancing products that are pushed out on the market, do they really help that outer layer?
Fantastic question. They will probably make your skin look shinier, but essentially you try to nourish the dead. Usually, to my knowledge, it doesn't work that much. Okay. So when, some advertisement says that, it feeds your hair and makes them more lively, well, unless you want your hair to become zombies, nothing can make them more lively. They're dead already. Okay. Same goes for the superficial layer of the skin. Keratin will make if it is absorbed by the external layer of the skin, that will probably be more shiny, more stretchable, but you're not really feeding your cells anyway. And if you want to get rid of the wrinkles, come on, people, Botox would work. And I can tell you the mechanism, how it works, once we get to the wrinkles, if you want. It's really simple. So, a little bit of the skin color and skin pigmentation. Cells that are responsible for the pigmentation of the skin are melanocytes. Melanocytes in the stratum basale produce the protein called melanin. It's the pigment that is found throughout the superficial structures in the human body. Let's put it this way. It is found in the skin. Essentially, it is found in the hair, and it is found in your eyes. Okay? It is found in the iris. Okay? So, the more melanin produced, the darker the skin is. This protein is packaged in the vesicles called melanosomes, And then those vesicles, essentially it's not diffusion, strictly speaking, it's exocytosis, endocytosis. So vesicles are transported from the stratum basale through the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum to the lower levels of the stratum corneum, giving your skin a color. And essentially, people with the darker skin produce more melanin, and it actually runs really nice. If you think about the correlation between the color of the skin and the color of the eyes. People with really fair skin, like people of Irish descent that are, say, red-headed, okay, they have green eyes. They produce very little melanin. The skin is really pale, okay? And what happens to them when they are exposed to the sun? Yeah, they can play lobster, right? People with a darker skin, they're much more resistant to the sunlight, but they rarely have blue eyes, honestly. If you look at them, people with darker skin would have brown eyes because the amount of melanin in the iris increases. The color of your eyes, it is determined entirely by the amount of melanin. Yes?
For people with dark skin,
Yes.
they have the light, they have the blue and the green eyes. Is that a form of albinism?
Brief answer is no. The point is, it is not so think about this. First of all, let's do a little step back, and it's actually a great moment to discuss this. I talk about it in microbiology way more than I do in AP, but it's still worth to bring up in AP. What is the trait? What does this word mean? Trait. Yes. Wait, not genetic. Physical what? Yeah, physical feature. Being what? Wait, that's genetic. Just from the physical standpoint, can you give me any traits? Huh? Eye color. Perfect. Something else. Height? Excellent. Something else. Skin color, hair color, all kinds of, you can think deeper and say, okay, some people are unfortunately genetically sick. Is that a trait? Of course, that is a trait. Some people are, from the beginning, more athletic than others. Is that a trait? Absolutely. Now, if you think about the traits, some of them are, and okay, what the information about the traits, where is it stored? In the DNA. Very good. Now we have a shitload of genes, 20 to 30,000 genes. Now think about this. When I'm 4-year-old and I'm now like 38-year-old, did we look different? Yeah, 4 years I was totally different. Did I have different genome back then? No, I had the same genes, all the same genes. Why did I look different when I was 4? Features undeveloped. What other? Okay, getting closer. But what determines my development? Genes are genes. I mean, what should happen to the genes? They have to be almost there. Expressed, right? You may have a gene, but if your cell doesn't make RNA out of it and then doesn't synthesize protein that is encoded in that gene, the feature is not there. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm trying to say? I always bring this, it's like a recipe book. If you have a recipe in the book, in a cookbook, unless you cook it, you cannot taste it. Does that make sense? You're not eating the paper. You're not eating the recipe. You're eating an apple pie. So unless you cook it, there is no apple pie. Same goes for the genes and the traits. Unless the gene is expressed, there is no trait, there's no physical feature. So when I was 4, I had certain set of genes expressed. Now I have slightly different set of genes expressed. I didn't have an allergy when I was 4, I have an allergy now. Probably something got messed up, okay, some gene expression. So the point is, going back to your question, people with, generally we say, okay, people with darker skin will have more melanin, which will also be reflected by the color of the eyes. But the skin color and the hair color will be determined not only by just melanin expression, but also by the, say, expression of the melanin gene in certain tissues. So if the expression of the melanin gene in your skin goes one way, but in your eyes another way, then you're going to have dark skin and you're going to have blue eyes. Can it happen? Sure. Is that frequent? No. It's extremely rare. Does that make sense? Did I explain it? Awesome. Now, the function of the melanin is to protect against UV light. And the more UV light we receive, the more melanin we produce. That's why we get tanned when we're exposed to UV light. But another interesting implication, I think, of this is if you look at the skin color of people living at the different latitude, you can definitely notice that people who live closer to equator, people who are exposed overall to the sunlight more, and I'm not talking about only now, I'm talking about generally differences, okay? People of the African descent, Mediterranean descent, north of the South America descent, regional tribes of South America, people of Australian Aboriginal descent, they all have dark skin. If you look at Nordics, people with Northern Europe descent, you know, Scandinavia, North Germany, they're very pale. The reason? Different exposure to the sunlight. Okay? I mean, if you have like it was a great summer this year in Sweden, all 2 days. So, different amount of sun. And over time, people with darker skin had better chance for survival. They were more comfortable outside. And that promoted them to be selected. They were more fit to live in a certain environment. Does that make sense? Now, freckles are melanin accumulation in the skin, just irregular. And when people with freckles are exposed to the sunlight, freckles become brighter because more melanin is produced. Finally, albinism. That's the genetic condition in which melanin is not produced. You may have seen the latest of the X-Men series, Logan, and at the end, that guy named Albino is exposed to the sunlight. I think his name was Albino. And he's just all start to, like, his skin starts to rupture. No, that's not going to happen to people who have albinism, but their skin is extremely sensitive to the sunlight. So they get sunburns very quickly. Okay? Now, you may have seen a condition called vitiligo. It's pretty much a partial albinism when you have a fragment of the skin that essentially does not produce melanin whatsoever. So you can see this absolutely white spots, okay, pale, totally pale skin. It is not a pathological condition. Period. So it's just a feature, a trait. Okay? So understand what's the vitiligo, what's the albinism, and what's the function of melanin. That's pretty much it. We good? Moving on. Dermis. Now, dermis is the deeper layer of the skin, and I want you to be able to operate in the anatomical terms of deep versus superficial. Does that make sense? So if I ask you the question, this is the most superficial layer of the epidermis, and I give you the list of answers, don't try to convince me that, I mixed up and you pick stratum basale because you kind of mixed up what superficial and deep is. Does that make sense? So please be absolutely confident in your ability to use superficial and deep. And I'm sorry, I will not help you explaining what's superficial and what is deep. You have to know that. Is that clear? So if you ask me, is that the outermost? My lips will be sealed. Now, dermis consists of just two layers. Very thin papillary layer. Very, very thin papillary layer. Papillary layer consists of the loose areolar connective tissue. So it harbors some immune cells, very loose, not a lot of collagen fibers, pretty much cushions. Okay. Reticular layer, the deepest layer of the dermis and technically the deepest layer of the skin right here. First of all, it's pretty thick, and it consists of dense irregular connective tissue. So please know which tissue comprises which layer, and understand, think about this. Your skin experiences a lot of pulling force. Maybe not extreme pulling force, but some. And this dense irregular connective tissue with collagen fibers running all directions really is the structural reinforcement of your skin. It can withstand those pulling forces into any direction. Am I clear? Now I want to highlight once again that the entire dermis, this pink part, is separated from the epidermis by the basement membrane. Okay? Now, if you look at this micrograph in the left corner of the slide, you can see the layers. So you can see very thin, let me make it red, very thin stratum basale. Then, let's be honest, stratum spinosum and stratum granulosum do not have a very clear boundary. Okay? And then you can definitely see very clear stratum corneum. What I want to tell you right now, I try to avoid, and I'm pretty successful at that, I try to avoid confusing anatomy questions. So you will not get the question with an arrow pointing here with the question, what layer is that? How are you supposed to know? It can be stratum spinosum at this layer, it can be stratum granulosum. It's really hard to say. Does that make sense? But if I point at this one, there's no second choice. Okay? So I'm just kind of giving you an idea what the question may look like. Am I clear? Any questions on the layers of dermis, reticular and papillary? No? Okay. Few features. The skin, well, first friction ridges. Friction ridges can be found on the skin of your hands and your feet. Okay? So like palms, soles. It allows us to grip on things. On the fingers, that's your fingertips. Sorry, that's your fingerprints. Okay. Other than that, nothing fancy. Just have to understand that those can be found only on the parts of the body that actually are dealing with grasping things, okay, gripping on the things. Because if we wouldn't have friction ridges, we wouldn't be able to walk barefoot, just sleep all the time. Okay. Cleavage lines. Yes. Go ahead. I hope I can answer.
If you burn your hands severely
Yes.
enough, would your fingerprints be able to show back, or would the scar tissue not recreate friction ridges?
Very good question. Depends on how deep. If you have first, second degree burn, then your skin will be completely restored and your friction ridges will be completely restored. If you have third degree burn, the pattern of the friction ridges may change because you will have probably the transplant, skin transplant, skin graft. Because third degree destroys skin completely. Okay? Does that make sense? So up to second, including second, you should be fine. But there were attempts by criminals to destroy friction ridges. As far as I know, people just before doing the crime. I kind of feel awkward telling you this. I hope you're not going to use it. But they treated the fingertips with acid. Pretty much kind of scraped the superficial layer of the skin and induced a chemical burn. And then they leave no fingerprints. Okay. Cleavage lines. That's really a clinically important feature. You can see on this gentleman here the direction of the cleavage lines. Essentially, it's the direction of the collagen fibers, okay, that is a predominant at the particular body site. So like predominant orientation of collagen fibers in your upper abdomen is transverse. They run horizontally. Okay? I'm not going to ask where is which direction, but you just think about it. You have different directions of those cleavage lines. Why it's so important? When you do the surgery, when you make a cut, you want to cut along the cleavage lines, not across. Because if you cut across the cleavage lines, then collagen fibers will exert the pulling forces at the edges of the cut, and they will slow down significantly the healing of the cut. On the opposite note, if you do along the cleavage lines, then the edges will close pretty nicely and the cut will heal much faster. Go ahead. You have how did or how do? We have the scheme, the layout. We've identified them before by studying. So now pretty much any surgeon would know that if he wants to operate on the upper abdomen, the incision that should be made in the transverse, not in the sagittal. Does that make sense? Go ahead. Oh, well, sometimes you just cannot avoid that. Sometimes you have to kind of open the person completely. At this point, I mean, if somebody requires the heart surgery, I think the cleavage line is the least of his problems. Seriously. Okay. Now, flexure lines. You can find flexure lines closer to the joints. Some of them, most of them, they're more prominent on your soles and on your palms. Since dermis is connected to the structure's deeper subcutaneous tissue, which is in turn connected to the muscles, when joints moving, dermis cannot perfectly accommodate that movement, pretty much like when you're clothing, okay? When you move around, your clothing gets wrinkles. That's the same, your dermis gets wrinkles, okay? Some people believe that flexure lines on the palm predict your fate. According to them, I should have been dead 5 years ago. And then resurrect, actually. Now, hair, that's pretty fascinating structure. Dead keratinized cells. So pretty much it's the, and we're going to talk about, it's outgrowth of the epithelium of the skin. Let's take a glance at the structure of the hair. First of all, on the very broad picture, in a very, very broad view, you can see the hair shaft. That's the part that elevates above the skin. That's what you see, those hairs, okay? That's hair shaft, okay? Now, hair root is the part of the hair that is under the skin. And it is anchored in the structure called hair follicle. And inside of the hair follicle, you can see the hair bulb, okay? And hair is surrounded by the multiple layers of the various types of cells. The outermost, the peripheral layer, is the connective tissue sheath. Okay? You see that? That's your connective tissue. And then connective tissue and epithelial are separated by the basement membrane, which in case of the hair is called glassy. And then you have layers of epithelial cells. Okay? And you can appreciate, if you look closer, this picture in the left bottom corner, you can appreciate that these cells of the external epithelial sheath, they look cuboidal. Cells of the internal epithelial sheath, cuboidal. And then as you move towards the hair, towards the cuticle, towards the medulla, towards the cortex, sorry, the other way around, cortex is outside, towards the cortex and medulla, cells may be flattened a little bit. Now if you think about it, imagine skin for a second. Imagine skin. Imagine skin epithelium, epidermis. Can you do that? I'm not really good with drawing and it would take me forever to draw this. So just try to imagine. Let's go back actually for a second. I would do this actually. Okay, imagine this. Micrograph. Now put the imaginary finger right here and start to press down, creating the deep, deep, deep invagination. Does that make sense? And then imagine that out of that imagination, stratum corneum starts to make a hair. What you end up with, all these layers. This connective tissue layer used to be a part of the dermis. These epithelial layers used to be a part of the epidermis. Does that make sense? You pretty much like fold in, and then there's a hair growing out of that fold. Okay? And this, the hair papilla, is the bunch of connective tissue that gets into the hair bulb. There are blood vessels here that provide cells of so-called hair matrix. You can see hair matrix here. That connective tissue provides cells of the hair matrix with oxygen and nutrients. You can also see melanocytes. Essentially, hair matrix is the stratum basale of the skin, but it doesn't produce the skin, it produces hair, which is also entirely dead. Does that make sense? Now, please understand anatomically hair shaft versus hair root. Okay? Understand what the function of hair matrix is, what it is. Okay? What is the function of the hair papilla? So hair papilla is the connective tissue that contains blood vessels delivering oxygen and nutrients to the hair. Hair matrix is the layer of basal cells that actually produce the hair. And, well, hair shaft is above the skin, hair root under the skin. Hair is actually pretty important. Sometimes, very often actually, hair is wrapped with nerve receptors. So when somebody touches your hair, think about this. Your hair is dead. It's not the hair that feels it. It's the nerve receptor in your skin that is wrapped around the hair that feels its movement. Does that make sense? Just a little cute observation. Nail. Yeah, they're like antennas. Sure, you can say it, of course. Nail. Pretty much extension of the skin that is heavily keratinized. Consists of this is going to be the free edge, that white part, okay? And in fact, if you would separate the nail from the finger, your entire nail would be white. Do you see what I'm saying? Entire nail would be white. The reason why only free edge is white is because there is nothing under it. No blood vessels. Okay? So that's your free edge. That's the nail body. Okay? And you can see the root of nail hidden under the nail fold. Make sense? So that nail fold is what actually anchors the nail to your finger. When you watch movies and there's scenes of torture when people get their nail involuntarily removed, that must be very painful, because they essentially separate the tissues that are not physically separated, because the nail grows on the nail bed, which is again structure similar. It looks a lot like a skin. So cells of the stratum basal in the nail bed, when they proliferate, they build up the nail on top of it. Okay? So cuticle that is formed at the nail fold, just an outgrowth of the skin that covers the nail. It's called, in fancy way, eponychium. Next time you do a manicure, you can shook your master with, can you please remove my eponychium? Now, nail is pink because blood vessels in the nail bed, they carry blood. If you would press on the nail, it will become white. You block the blood flow. And then, you release and you can just see it becomes pink again. The lunule is at the nail root. So that's the part where the epithelium is particularly thick over the nail matrix. That's why it looks white. And here, the hyponychium, the edge of the nail, at the edge of the nail, okay, free edge, it provides additional sort of whiteness, and hyponychium is formed of the very thick stratum corneum. If you ever had your nails removed completely, and unfortunately I experienced that, you can look at the free edge, and it's much thicker than the body of the nail, because of that thick stratum corneum. So for the nail, know three parts: root, body, free edge. Know the proximal fold and its function. It holds the nail in. And know what the nail bed does. That it's actually a structure which grows the nail. The stratum basale of the nail bed is why the nail grows. Glands of the skin. We're going to talk the glands, we're going to talk muscles, and we're going to take a break before the diseases. You will put your quizzes there. We're going to go over the quizzes. I will give you a break, and we will start microscopy. How about that? Sounds good? Awesome. Sebaceous, holocrine gland, which means what happens to the cells of the holocrine gland when they secrete? There are three types: holocrine, apocrine, merocrine. What happens to the holocrine cells? Yeah, they die. They die completely. They release all their content. Okay, and you can see. So that's a sebaceous gland here. Okay, you can see the duct, and you can see the sebaceous glands around hair shafts. They look like grapes, bunches of grapes. See them? Those little thingies. So these bunches of grapes produce oily secretion, which lubricates the hair and somewhat lubricates the skin and prevents skin from drying out. When you wash your hands very often, what happens to your skin? It dries out. Yes, it dries out, and it starts, like you may have eczema and all other problems, right? Because if you wash them too often, you take all the oil from the skin away. Okay, I worked in the lab where we had to wash our hands very often, and we had a soap and a hand lotion. And it was really useful because by the end of the day, your hands are dead. Just, it's awful. Okay. Now, this sebum, that substance that sebaceous glands produce, it contains a lot of fatty acids, which are presumably have antibacterial properties. Now, interesting thing, I'm going to give you sort of a peek into it. So fatty acids are a great nutrient. There are bacteria that live in your sebaceous glands. This bacteria is called Propionibacterium acnes. And normally, it doesn't cause anything. But when kids hit puberty, the changes in hormone production, increased estrogen in females and testosterone in males, stimulate enormous production of sebum. When kids hit the puberty, their skin becomes much oilier. That oil comes from the sebaceous glands. Now, Propionibacterium acnes that sits in the sebaceous glands have a field day. And they start to reproduce a lot. And in some people, that causes massive inflammation of the hair follicle, and that is acne. It's your normal bacteria. It doesn't go anywhere, you don't acquire it from the environment. You cannot get rid of it. It's just there. Okay. Some people have more production, more sebum produced, so Propionibacterium acnes replicate to a larger extent, and the immune system starts to recognize it as a bad thing. Okay. Now, sweat glands. First, merocrine. You can see, well, on this picture, they are not really specified. The one that is shown here is the apocrine, but structurally they are very similar. So merocrine sweat gland is the exocrine gland that produces so-called hypotonic sweat. Do you remember how merocrine glands function? What happens to the cells in the merocrine glands? They remain intact. Merocrine, they do completely intact. So they produce sweat, they package sweat in the little vesicles. Those vesicles get out into the duct, and that sweat that you produce from apocrine sweat glands, it's not stinky. No, it's like, you know, forehead, body sweat. Like when you work out and you're just drenching, that's your apocrine, merocrine sweat, the hypotonic sweat. That's why you taste salty. You know, when you work out a lot, and then if you would lick your skin, you would taste the salt, sodium chloride. Okay. It also contains a bunch of antibodies and dermicidin. Dermicidin is an interesting, it's a peptide that has non-specific antibacterial properties. Obviously, the microbes of your skin are resistant, okay, to dermicidin, and microbes that are not normally present on your skin are supposedly not resistant. Apocrine sweat glands, they are bigger and they are inactive till, depends on the child, about 9, 10, sometimes later, 12 years of age. Apocrine sweat glands, which are shown in this picture, so that's apocrine, they can be found mostly in the parts of the body like armpits and groin, and they produce stinky sweat. So apocrine cells, as you remember, they do not remain completely intact. Parts of them are released, okay, parts of them are sort of chopped off, okay, and not only water and sodium chloride, but also all the organic content of the cell, okay, gets on the surface of the skin. Does that make sense? Good. That organic content of the cell then is consumed by the microbes that live on your skin, and the products of that metabolism is what makes the smell. And they are, and think about this, when you have like a 3-4-year-old, they smell fantastic. They never stink. Well, unless they like poop themselves all over the place. But when kids grow up and they become like 10, 11, 12, you know, you walk into their room, it smells like locker room. Okay? 2 reasons. 1, they don't put their socks in the washing machine. 2, sweat. Okay? This little precious teens start to stink. Another hypothetical component of the apocrine sweat is pheromones. Okay? Now, what are the pheromones? Can anyone tell me? No? Good.
Supposedly we're using information that are in our sweat, like that we get off, and other people can identify you through it.
Yes. It's not so much like personal identification, because they work at a very subtle level. They regulate, supposedly, sexual attraction. The role of pheromones in the primitive animals, like in insects, is known very well. There are examples. You can put the trap and put, like, I don't know, a piece of paper infused with pheromones on the trap. Butterflies can sense the smell, can sense the pheromones from the distances of 3-4 miles, and they will fly directly into the trap. And it is used in the pest control when they install traps that collect the pests. Now, what about humans? The problem with science is that scientists generally avoid giving you the answers, yes, definitely. Okay? They will say, yeah, you know, we think, maybe. So, there are 2 pieces of evidence, I think, that suggests that we do produce pheromones, and they really play a role in physiological responses. One is period syncing in female groups. If you have a bunch of females working together, at some point, the menstrual periods will become synced. Hypothesis is that they all produce pheromones, and those pheromones somehow influence their reproductive system and make periods sync. Another interesting, really interesting study. So let me try to explain it try to recollect how it was done. So they had a group of women and a group of men, and women never saw men. They were like, in the beginning, they were totally separated. Men worked out. Each man worked out in a t-shirt. Those t-shirts were collected and were given to that group of females, and they smelled each of these sweaty t-shirts, and they sort of ranked t-shirts in the degree of attractiveness, how much they liked what they sensed, sort of subconscious attraction. This t-shirt really stood out. They never saw the men. They never saw who wore which t-shirt. And then those same groups of males and females were brought together, and females were told to pick up the male. Just, select one of the group, the one that they liked the most. And guess what? I'm not sure it was 100%, but it was vast majority that the female selected the male which t-shirt she found, the most attractive in terms of the smell. Pheromones, maybe. That make sense? Yes.
I remember, because I think there's got to be some truth to that. When we were completely separated from females during training, during initial training, the minute that all the guys were, we could be in the field like getting smoke, and if there was a female like shoulder, it like within 50 feet like that, we couldn't see, like we knew. It's a weird thing. Like, if anybody ever goes and you're like Fort Benning or anything like that, we're training separated. So there's got to be some truth to it. I mean, she didn't have to.
That is possible. That is entirely possible. Because we don't know. I mean, let me tell you something. Dogs are usually the sort of considered to have the best sense of smell. I mean, they have awesome, but we're very good. Let me put it this way. Don't underestimate yourself. Few very simple things. So erector pili muscles. Pilus means hair. Okay. Oh crap! These squares are completely shifted. Okay, sorry. They just totally shifted. Don't pay attention to this. I just noticed. Squares are shifted from the place they were supposed to be. Don't pay attention to the squares. So erector pili muscles. Red squares were supposed to be around them. Erector pili muscles, they elevate the hair. Okay, in response to things like cold or when you're excited. Now, those responses, where do they come from? Why do you elevate your hair when you are frightened? Why do you have, you have goosebumps, right? Your hair goes up. Where does it come from? Muscles constrict, they elevate the hair, but what is the evolutionary role of that response? Why? How does the elevated hair defend the dog? In what sense intimidating? Bigger. Well, we're not looking at any bigger with, goosebumps, right? It's pretty much a response that has no role in protection. It's just a remains of what we used to have. What about cold? Why hair get elevated when it's cold?
Well, because if your hair was thicker, it would be more clustered together, kind of insulating.
Yeah. When hair is elevated, it keeps more air inside, so it provides better insulation. Again, at our level, it doesn't. Okay, so no. Now, nerve receptors. We have a bunch of various nerve receptors in the skin. These receptors in this picture are shown in yellow color. These ones, you know. So these nerve receptors essentially senses all kinds of perceptions. It can be mechanical sensations. It can be sensations of, I don't know, temperature, chemical burn. When you are itching, that's chemicals. And actually, interesting thing, you know, when you are itching, it's the same chemicals that cause pain, sensation of pain. Just very little of those chemicals. Okay. Now, the layer under the skin, the layer under the dermis, deeper, is called subcutaneous tissue. You can see that layer of fat, subcutaneous adipose tissue. It is not considered to be a part of the skin, but it plays an important role. It interacts with the skin all the time. Now, if you look at the adipose tissue, subcutaneous adipose tissue, okay, it has two major functions. First, it insulates you. If you would look at polar animals, the polar bear, seals, penguins, that live in the colder climates, they all have fairly thick layers of the fat under their skin. That fat layer protects them from excessively losing heat. Make sense? Now, in terms of thermoregulation, again, if you would look at the subcutaneous layer, there's a bunch of blood vessels here that branch and, you know, get into the dermis. So those blood vessels, as we discussed before, can dilate when you are hot, dissipating the heat in the environment, or they will constrict when the environment is cold, conserving the heat, preventing blood from reaching the surface of your body. Does that make sense? So essentially, what you have to know about subcutaneous layer, insulation, thermoregulation, and you have to understand how skin helps you to control your body temperature. One option is to use the blood vessels, right? Either constricting or dilating, and another option is to produce sweat, which evaporates. Does that make sense? Now I have a question for you. So the subcutaneous, well, I'm not going to say it yet. Why a lot of drugs are injected under your skin? Excellent. Yes. There are a lot of blood vessels, and drugs can easily access blood vessels from under your skin. Make sense? Let's take a break.